Hello again, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Effective Training, Oversight, and Communication, Key Practices to Support Volunteer Ombudsmen and Minimize Risk. My name is Amity Overall-Labe, and I'm the Director of the National Ombudsman Resource Center, and we're really excited to have so many people on the line today. We are very pleased to have Mary Ann Parker. She's the Interim State Ombudsman for the DC Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. Kelly Miller, the Volunteer Services Supervisor for the Wisconsin Ombudsman Program, and Sarah Hensman, the Volunteer Ombudsman Program and AmeriCorps Vista Project Coordinator with the Iowa Program, here with us today. After I provide a brief introduction, Mary Ann, Kelly, and Sarah will share some policies, procedures, and practices that they use to reduce risk and manage volunteers in their program. Then we'll have time for questions, and I'll close the webinar by sharing some resources. So a few housekeeping items. For those of you that are not familiar with GoToWebinar, you can use the red arrow to expand or collapse your control panel, and that's the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. For your audio, you can choose to use your telephone by clicking the circle next to telephone, and you can call in that using that number, or you can use your mic and speakers. All lines are currently muted. We will unmute them. We will take questions. And if you have a question during that portion of the webinar, you can click the hand icon to raise your hand, and we'll let you know when you can speak and unmute your line. Or you can send us a message in the chat box, which is also in that box on the right-hand side of your screen. As you may have heard, we are recording this webinar, and the recording and all the materials we talk about today will be available after today's webinar. We will send a link to the webinar recording and materials, also in a follow-up email to all the registrants for today's webinar. Since today's webinar is about volunteer management, I wanted to include some language from the final Ombudsman rule about volunteers. I won't spend a lot of time on this today, but I did want to call your attention to this. As you may know, the final Ombudsman rule was published on February 11th, 2015, and it's effective July 1 of this year. The rule expands upon the intent of the Older Americans Act and gives more detail regarding the role and responsibilities of the Ombudsman program. So in particular, some pieces of the rule that apply to volunteers is the definition of what it means to be a representative of the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman. That means that employees and volunteers may be designated by the Ombudsman to fulfill the duties set forth in the rule of the Ombudsman program. Also, pertaining to volunteers, the state ombudsman program is required to have policies and procedures that include a grievance process. The grievance process must include the receipt and review of grievances regarding the determinations or actions of the ombudsman and representatives of the office. And as you heard from the earlier definition, representatives include both staff and volunteer ombudsmen. The grievance process must include the opportunity for reconsideration of the ombudsman, meaning the state ombudsman decision to suspend, remove designation of a local ombudsman entity or an individual representative of the office. Also in 1327.17, in the responsibilities of agencies hosting what's called local ombudsman entities, or you may hear LOEs, the agency in which a local ombudsman entity is in shall be responsible for the personnel management, but not the programmatic oversight of the representatives. Again, representatives including employees and volunteers of the office. And then in 1327.19, duties of representatives of the office states that the ombudsman may designate a local entity and designate an employee or volunteer of the local entity as a representative of the office. For more information on the rule, we have an entire web page dedicated to the rule, and that includes some resources from AOA, including a webinar recording about the rule, and some resources produced by NORC, such as the summary of the rule, some charts with rule language, some briefs, specifically one about state organizational conflict of interest and local organizational conflict of interest, and the grievance process, as well as some technical assistance responses. So visit that website for some more information. And if you have some specific questions about what this means for your program, what rule implementation will look like for your program in your state, make sure to contact your state ombudsman. So moving into the content of today's webinar. Last year, for those of you that were on the webinar, we discussed risk management related to volunteer recruiting, screening, and initial certification training. Today, we'll continue that conversation of risk management, but our focus will be on practices related to the oversight of volunteer activities, such as facility visits, complaint investigations, consultations, continuing education and training, reporting, evaluation, and so on. A link to last year's webinar will be shared later when I talk about some resources, but I wanted to share a couple points from the webinar as an introduction and a recap for today's topic. As we discussed last year, opportunities for risk to your program and those that you serve can arise for a variety of reasons. It could be how an ombudsman manages volunteers. Oftentimes you are managing from a distance, especially if you're in a large region. The actual work of the volunteer ombudsman, when you think about it, they're in and out of facilities, they're engaging with different people every single day whenever they're visiting and performing the duties of the program, and or the volunteer's behavior. So risk management never ends. It really is supposed to be an ongoing process. It's not a one-time event to analyze and remove potential risk. Ombudsman programs really need to consider and plan for risk in each step of the process, from recruitment and screening of a volunteer all the way through a volunteer leaving the program. The definition of risk is anything that threatens the ability of a nonprofit to accomplish its mission. And risk management is simply a discipline that enables people and organizations to cope with uncertainty by taking steps to protect its vital assets and resources. As you know, volunteer ombudsmen increase resident access to the program. They expand ombudsman program services, bring a variety of skills and experiences to the ombudsman role, and strengthen the connection between the ombudsman program and the local community where they serve. And they certainly enhance the quality of life and care for residents. So they're simply invaluable to the ombudsman program. But due to the unique role and responsibilities of the program, there are potential risks that need to be addressed. The nature of ombudsman work, ombudsmen are often in a position of trust. They're given access to residents and the residents' confidential information. So there's a lot of opportunities for something to go wrong and threaten the ability of the ombudsman program to accomplish its mission. So some examples of areas of risk include obtaining personal confidential information. Volunteers have access to residents, facilities, and others. They represent the state ombudsman program and the local ombudsman entity, if that's applicable in your state. They directly impact program performance and outcome. They have a significant degree of independence. Their actions could harm those you serve and your program. They may act outside of their role and responsibilities. And they drive to their assigned facilities and other ombudsman-related activities. And again, they're often personally impacted by their work, so both negatively and positively. So they could experience some burnout or compassion fatigue. So that's my introduction and a brief overview and highlight of risk management and what that means to the Ombudsman program. I do want to move into our presentations from our speakers today, and then we'll have plenty of time to talk about scenarios and time for questions for our presenters. So first, I want to bring up Mary Ann, and if you'll give me 1 minute, everyone, I'm going to switch controls over to her. And Mary Ann, if you'll go ahead and unmute your line.
Okay.
There you go. I can hear you. Great. Thank you. And I see your slides.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Amity. Our volunteer coordinator with the DC Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program, Hennessy's Catch It On, had hoped to be giving this presentation, but I hope as her fill-in today, I will do it justice because it is an incredibly important topic. As Amity just said, volunteers are so crucial to the programs, and so in order to make it successful for the volunteer and for our program, we have to manage the risk. And through that, we have to develop strategies. And I'll talk a little bit about that right now. And one of the successful strategies or strategies we need to talk about is kind of looking from where the volunteers come into our program. And they often express three concerns: that their volunteer work will be a waste of time, their skills and talents will be utilized inappropriately, and they may be placed in jobs for which they are not suited. So during the recruitment and selection process, we really need to fully inform the volunteers about the Ombudsman program, job duties, training requirements, and time commitments. Some people have kind of a little difficulty understanding what really the Ombudsman program encompasses. And then, armed with the information provided on their application and the interview, it is the Ombudsman program's responsibility to see that the volunteer then is successfully matched with a facility, because that's usually one of their primary duties. And when we talk about how to match volunteer ombudsmen to facilities, I think we can all agree that the first step is to involve the volunteer in the placement decision. And just what we talked about before in the earlier slide about skill sets, it's important then to talk to them about the skill sets they have. What would they like to utilize? Some people might have no sign language. Some others might know a foreign language, speak fluent Spanish, and that might help direct to which facility would be a good placement. Again, so that was very important to talk. Some people have medical background, and then other input from the residents, the volunteers. And again, location, I know in our area and probably everywhere plays a big consideration for volunteers. Is it located where I live? Is it easy to get to? So those are one of the other topics we always like to talk about. So we definitely get the impact, again, about their skill sets, different preferences. And then we provide them, if they do kind of think where they might like to go, this one facility, we provide them with information about the selected facility so they get a good idea, maybe survey reports, maybe just a fact sheet about the size, amount of residents, because we've had, in the past, and someone could say, oh, I didn't know it was so big. I don't know if I feel comfortable with such a big facility. Or, no, maybe I'll think about another one. So we try to, again, get input from them and then provide them with information as well. And another factor we do is consider the makeup of the volunteers already assigned to the facility. If we've already moved a couple new volunteers there, it might not be the time to put yet another new volunteer. Also, time commitments. If you have a couple volunteers that maybe go away in the winter, putting the third or fourth volunteer there that also goes away in the winter may not be a good makeup. And then again, it's personality. So, getting to know the volunteers, you might figure out what the personality is. So again, I think it's really important to match the volunteer ombudsman to the correct facility and, to follow all these steps. And in the midst of all this is to then discuss and promote personal safety. We always assign an experienced ombudsman as a mentor to new recruits, just to answer questions, provide input, guidance. It's very important and a really good thing we always try to do immediately. And then we just develop practical measures to ensure the safety and comfort of the volunteer. We make sure that they all have the appropriate identification, the badges, with the picture around their neck, that they know that the visitation protocols, we go over signing in and what they need to do as they visit so they feel comfortable. We tend to, in our program, and this may not be the same all over the country, we kind of limit the volunteers' visits to the facility during what we call business hours or daytime hours. So we kind of go over what hours that we generally have the visits. So we kind of structure the protocol of the visits, when they have the visits, make sure they have the right ID, how to utilize the right ID, just to kind of ensure that they feel comfort level and safe when they walk in and make their first visit. We do require kind of a strict adherence to the safety first policy, look over any necessary regulations. Again, we'll look over protocols for visits, look over anything if there's a national disaster, is there sheltering in place? How does that work? And then we kind of just go over examples of when maybe safety first would come into play. For example, in DC, the parking lots near the nursing homes are relatively small, some of them, so you cannot park in the parking lot. And so many of the volunteers have to park around the corner. But some of them, just because it's busy place, have to park maybe several blocks away, and for many reasons don't feel safe or sure about walking. Again, So then we talk to them. If you don't feel safe, or if you don't feel confident in making the walk, then think about yourself and maybe don't go that day. Now, if there's a care plan or something you have to be there, please let us know, and we always make sure they have sufficient contact information and who to contact if you can't get a hold of that person, so they can let us know so we don't let down the resident or anything they need to do. But again, that they kind of have to understand where they have their comfort level, and again, safety first. And so we try to get them in the program, make a successful match, make sure they feel comfort, that they feel safe, and then we want to monitor the volunteer performance, because if you begin to monitor the performance, then hopefully minimizes risk, minimize surprise. I know many organizations use kind of an informal evaluation process. Formal evaluation forms, though, do, I think, benefit programs because they allow them to actually kind of really do real-time structured monitoring of what the volunteers are doing, and I think we find that it increases volunteer productivity. Though you're evaluating the volunteer, I think it also helps increase their sense of value as a part of the overall team, because you're looking at it, you're understanding maybe some give and take and understand what they're doing. It also allows you, and this is what we're talking about today, to monitor their progress and the problems to really on a real-time basis in a little bit more of a formal way than maybe what we did before. More importantly, and very important, is to increase the effectiveness of the volunteer component of service delivery to the clients and the public. I mean, that's what we're all about. So we want to really make sure it's effective. And just and probably most of you know this, but just never can go over it enough, is to maintain organized and complete files on each volunteer. Make sure that each file contains, accurate job descriptions, the volunteer's agreement to perform the services, so that when they come back and they have a question, you have that agreement. The application, training records, job description, notes on progress and problems, and awards and recognition. So you keep this organized and complete file for each volunteer. And then it's really important to tell them, about the program's evaluation process, so there's no surprises, and I think that's really important. And again, instill that kind of team spirit into the volunteers. They understand the goal, they understand what they're doing and how important it is. But again, that they're also being, there is oversight. We have oversight of the nursing homes. We do have oversight of our volunteers and the staff that goes in there, so it is important. And then we do want to make sure that each volunteer evaluates supervisors and the program's volunteer component. And I think it's important that they also have a chance to evaluate the program. And it's kind of a further step in the volunteer evaluation, to ask them to evaluate their supervisor and the entire volunteer component of the program. This ensures that the volunteers also know that it's reciprocal. We're just not looking over you. We want to see, when you're out there, what do you think of us or what we're doing, and maybe you can come up with some good input. I mean, it really allows them to provide feedback for improving the program. I know it's improved our program. It helped us kind of rethink how effective we were being at resident council meetings, kind of rethought what we were supposed to be doing at resident council meetings. Also alerted us of some other family council meetings that weren't happening. So it kind of got us on the whole resident family council to kind of refocus our program a few years ago. We also had stopped doing a newsletter, and a volunteer kind of re-energized us about doing the newsletter, and again brought a skill set. So she thought this was a really good way of communicating with the residents. So again, it really helped our program to have them, look back and say, this is what we think you all could do better. Now, when we're doing it, and we're talking about some great input from volunteers, we also know, and this is what we're talking about, is that today challenging volunteers. Over the course of the volunteer services, we report that it's common to encounter some problems. So in our book, we have the 8 R's to handle difficult volunteers. And then we reconnoiter to find out what is really wrong. Someone might be just upset about a visit, or there might be some, there might be an ombudsman saying something about the volunteer, a resident, that facility. So what exactly happened and what went wrong? What is the problem? And to really kind of cut away, peel all the layers off the onion. And if it is maybe a communication problem, maybe then we need to reassign the volunteer to a different staff person. Maybe there's just some communication about what they're supposed to be doing and how they're reporting it back. Or we retrain the volunteer to be able to do the job efficiently. Sometimes our volunteers, they are volunteers, so they may miss a portion. They might leave a little early or come a little late, and they've missed this portion about complaint investigation or about some of the visitation protocols or, discussions with residents. So they need to just kind of maybe go back and retrain them. It isn't that they don't have the will or maybe the skill base, but maybe just some retraining. And maybe they even sometimes come to us and say, I think I need to go over that again. And if that happens, I think that's really good. Revitalize a volunteer through a timeout period from responsibility. Sometimes I say, let's just, stop at the end. Let's just take a month or two and come back. Now, I don't say that indefinitely, but we have thought maybe a month or two, especially if maybe there's some other personal things going on with the volunteer's life. Let's just take a timeout and then come on back. Remotivate the volunteer. I mean, they could have gone through something, saw something, one of the favorite residents passed away, so we need to kind of remotivate. So they really still are a very good volunteer, but maybe the cynical dialogue they're having now or maybe a negative attitude, they just need to be motivated. It's not that we have to, decertify them. You can rotate a volunteer to a new setting. We've had volunteers that are just really better at outreach and community events than going into a nursing home. You can refer the volunteer to another agency, though I always say only if appropriate. We're not just trying to pass someone along because most of the agencies we work with do deal with vulnerable populations as well, but it's appropriate. And then to retire the volunteer with honor. If you have to decertify or have them move on, again, we always talk about dignity and respect of the residents, so we want to try to do this as much as we can with dignity and respect. So those are kind of the 8 R's that we try to go through in every process. And then after we've gone through all of that, exhausted all the alternatives, and the only alternative then is to decertify the volunteer, our goal is then to make the transition as smooth as possible. And here's some ideas to consider. Of course, as we all know, document. We always do some personal counseling, and again, getting down to the specific problem. We had talked about that in the future you were just going to visit these residents. This is what you were going to do. You were going to attend the resident council meetings. What happened when you started to visit and go up to those other floors? What exactly happened? So we try to still do some personal counseling, not just to say, no, that's it, so let's talk about it. Again, as I said, so if you have to decertify, you can refer to other volunteer opportunities if appropriate. And in our case, those would be sometimes when the person is much more maybe data-driven. They were a researcher their whole life, and they really don't know if they just want to deal with folks, but they want to go somewhere where they really just review data or maybe help compile reports. And there's places in D.C. that are really appropriate that could help, and even for the seniors and the elderly. So then we would have refer them then. And then, we always thank them for their service. And, as much as we really want to make this go well for the individual volunteer, we don't want to allow one volunteer to undermine the program. So we have to understand that one volunteer can really have a very negative impact if we don't contain it and minimize the risk, and then have to decertify or move the volunteer on if appropriate. Again, doing it appropriately, but you may have to it has to happen sometimes. And, regarding the grievance procedure, we want to make sure that all paid staff and volunteers are aware of it and they understand the process. So it isn't that we, go through this all and they go, I didn't even know there was a grievance procedure, or we don't even know there is. Maybe one of the volunteers in the field a lot doesn't know. So we want to make sure that all paid staff and volunteers are aware of it and understand the process. And that is my 10 minutes.
Thank you.
The Ombudsman program.
Thank you, Marianne. That was great. I really appreciate that and look forward to the questions. But now I'm going to move to Kelly. If you'll give me one moment, I'll transfer the controls to you. And go ahead and unmute yourself. And Marianne, okay. If you'll. Great. Thank you, Kelly. I can see them.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Amity. I'm going to talk about 4 successful forms of communication for oversight of volunteer ombudsman activities. And this presentation mainly talks about communication, relationship building, and maintaining those boundaries. So first I'm going to talk about educate and meet with the nursing home administration, informal volunteer meetings, formal volunteer in-services, and long-term care ombudsman 1-800 line. So in meeting with the nursing home administration, this volunteer ombudsman program has established several opportunities to develop professional relationships with the nursing home staff while educating and discussing the role of the program. So the first one I'm going to talk about is what we call a provider kickoff meeting, and these are unique because right now for Wisconsin, the program covers 30 of the 72 counties. So we'd like to have them in every single one. Our regional ombudsmen are in every single county, but our volunteer ombudsman program, like I said, is only in 30 of the 72. So we offer up what's called a provider kickoff meeting. It's conducted by the volunteer services supervisor, which is me, and the volunteer coordinator. And we do this as a courtesy for all nursing homes in the counties which we are going to be adding to the volunteer program. And that is a really neat meeting. It's very well received. For the administration is invited to a neutral location, the program, and have an opportunity to ask questions and get those questions answered. And it also establishes that relationship right from the get-go. The other one discussed is exit interviews. And this, of course, are discussions with the designated nursing home administration focusing on the residents' concerns and observations following every visit by the volunteer and the coordinators, or the volunteer and the volunteer supervisor, which is me. So the exit interviews are really important, and we try to have a face-to-face exit. A lot of times that doesn't happen, so we have alternates, which I can talk about during the question time. But the exit interview face-to-face is really, really important. And I tell the administration that you want to hear what our volunteers have to say on behalf of the residents. That's why we're here, and it's things that they have observed. Next, in meeting with the nursing home administration is, of course, an open door policy. And that is extended to the nursing home administration to call and discuss any concerns regarding the volunteers, the visits made by the volunteers, and the issues brought forth by the volunteer. All the questions are responded to by the volunteer coordinator and or the volunteer supervisor, which is me, and it is responded to in according to program policy. But first and foremost, I want them to know that whatever they have to say is listened to. So my first words are, I am listening, what can I do for you today? So that they feel a little bit of validation as well. It does not mean that we are provider friendly by any means, because we are resident-centered advocates to the fullest extent. But I do want them to feel comfortable sharing concerns with me so that I can re-explain the program, what our volunteers do, and our policies according to meeting the needs of the residents that we serve. They're pretty well received. I have some administrators who call me continuously, and by the end of the phone conversation, everybody is feeling okay about what the volunteer ombudsman program is doing for the residents in their facilities. The final one I want to talk about is something really cool and unique that we have here. It's called the Focus Conference. It's a unique opportunity provided by the State Department of Health Services, and it's an annual conference as a time for the nursing home staff, advocates, which includes the regional ombudsman and the volunteer coordinators, and the surveyors to come together and be in the same conference, attending sessions, presenting sessions, and listening and networking and being together. And the Board on Aging and Long-Term Care, we have an exhibit booth staffed usually with myself to answer questions, and we have, it's busy, it's a nonstop booth where the providers are coming up and getting resources and posters and asking, my favorite question they ask is, when can I get a new or another volunteer ombudsman, because we haven't had one in a while. So that tells me that the relationships and the communication is working, that we're doing something really cool. We also have something that is called the informal volunteer meeting, and we've named them coffee clatches just because they are routinely scheduled around the informal in-services and usually done in the summertime and holidays. And it's a time to sit and have a cup of coffee or tea. Either we make it and they come here, or we go to a place and they can enjoy that. But it's really geared around 2 to 5 volunteers who are invited by the volunteer coordinator, so they can select who they want to invite. And it's in a location that is quiet and low key. Maybe have a treat. You know, people are enjoying themselves, kind of feeling relaxed. They have a tendency to share a little bit more information, so that sometimes things come out that are overstepping those boundaries and they don't really realize it. And with myself there and a coordinator and possibly an ombudsman, we kind of pick up on that. We can discuss that right away, and it comes out in a low-key fashion. So the volunteers are in a small group. They provide, it's an increased comfort level to share information with each other and us. As I noted in the larger groups, some volunteers were hesitant to speak up when we have formal in-services with 30-plus people. And when I would approach them on the side, they would be like, well, my concern isn't as important, or it doesn't seem as necessary to talk about. But it really is, because each person has something valuable to offer. So we wanted to give them a chance to do that. So the discussions are open, but based on the information submitted on their volunteer monthly reports. And that's really key, because they're taking their time to go to these nursing homes every week for 3+ hours, going maybe 4 or 5 times a month. And that information on that report is critical to the regional ombudsman and critical to us for the care of those residents. So we want to make sure that we discuss information from those reports and from their visits. During these little coffee clutches, the volunteers receive updates from our staff and support. I'm usually at those coffee clutches. It's not necessary for an ombudsman to be there because it is run by the volunteer coordinator, but when we do have luck having an ombudsman there, it is really important for these discussions to take place, and the volunteers feel really grateful that they get information from all of our staff, and then remedies to their potential risks or issues that have come about. And what happens is 1 or 2 people are talking about it, and then more people say, yeah, that happened to me, and thank you for that answer. So I have to say that since we've instilled these coffee clutches, the volunteers ask for them and really love coming to them. So that's nice. We also have formal volunteer meetings, and they're called in-services. And the in-services are scheduled in advance, and they take place every February, April, and October in each of the 5 regions that we have volunteer coordinators. So we do have quite a few in-services scheduled. A standard agenda is based on determination of needs and volunteer requests. And one of the ones that is mandatory is October, is resident rights, of course. So all of the October in-services, whether there's 5 or 8 scheduled, are all on resident rights. And that is done in tandem with the regional ombudsman, and they do a really great job doing something new and different each year, because the resident rights don't change, but they do it different so that the volunteers want to pay attention, they want to get the information, and they like it. So it is kind of a neat opportunity for our team to work together. These formal meetings are large group sessions, and they include all the volunteers. So before, when I said the coffee clutches were select volunteers in smaller groups, these are the large sessions for all of the volunteers in the coordinator's region. So if a coordinator has 3 counties, all of them are invited from the 3 counties. If they have 8 counties, they're all invited from the 8 counties. Volunteers can attend the in-services in any region if they cannot attend their own session. So they're pretty standardized in-services, and that's really good, because we can have volunteers, if they have to miss one in their region, they can, if they're in a different region for vacation or visiting someone, or they just want to take a drive because they can make it, they're allowed to do that. And then we can pay them mileage for that as well, which is something that they don't do it for that, but it is something that helps out just a little bit in people's budgets. So the formal meetings are continued. The in-services, like I said before, the volunteer coordinators conduct a session with the regional ombudsman, and we also have guest presenters, and that includes myself. So I do attend quite a few of them. I attend every single one in April, because that is in accordance with our recognition events. We also have, networking opportunities between the volunteers. They have really come to like and know each other, and they value that time together as friends. Whether they do something outside of the program or not, they do sit by each other and talk to each other and feel more comfortable. also a time for face-to-face problem solving with the regional ombudsman and the supervisors, which include myself and Kim Marheine, who is the Regional Ombudsman Services Supervisor. So we have a lot of staff there, and a lot of times we have our state ombudsman, Heather Bremer, there, which is wonderful to have her, and sometimes we have our legal counsel there. So it's valuable information that is shared and discussed throughout the session. We evaluate potential risks of the program. Again, this isn't a larger group, so everybody does get the same information, and the information from the coffee clatches, the smaller groups, is also brought up into the larger in-services when we're talking. So it gives people a nice opportunity to have that information, and it lets people know that, you know, we don't want you to cross over the boundaries. It is, again, like Marianne said, safety for not only the volunteer, but for, of course, the residents that we serve, making their life very quality through our volunteers and the increased advocacy efforts that they provide. We also have something really neat. It's called the 1-800 line laminate card, and I don't have a card for each of you. If you would like me to send you one, I can. But we do have this handout in a paper form that Amity can provide later, and it is also in each of our training manuals. So the Board on Aging Long-Term Care 800 line is provided to educate for the use of the 800 line during the mandatory training. Receive a copy in the training manual, and of course a special laminated card is in their facility packet at the time of placement. So this card is really neat because, one, it is clarify what and when volunteers are to report on their facility visits. A lot of times they don't know, is this an emergency or not? You know, we're not an emergency service, so you know, it just clarifies that for the volunteers. We need that information. Volunteers are able to provide timely, critical resident information with more details for the Ombudsman and the Board on Aging staff. We can't stress this enough, that it can't wait for the time of the monthly report to come in because too much time has passed. So calling that 800 line gets the information to this agency timely. Number 3, the calls for the 800 line decrease the number of messages left for the coordinator and the staff. So we don't want volunteers having to think, oh my gosh, did they get this message? I need to call again. You know, it really decreases the call. So they just make the one call to the 800 line. They know that their information is safe, it's confidential, and it's going to be answered by somebody. It also, number 4, avoid ombudsman and coordinator missing calls due to extended time out of the office. Obviously, as you all know who are on this call, you are very, very busy people. You're not always at your desk waiting for phone calls, and there are times that a lot of calls are coming in and you're out. So if this call goes to the 800 line, it is documented and triaged to the right person. All calls to our 800 line are answered several times a day by the intake coordinator, and again, triaged to the appropriate staff and documented in our Ombuds Manager so that we have that information. So if a call is missed, we can go back into our database and look up the time frame, the phone number, and what the situation was. So it does really help our volunteers, and not only help our volunteers, but it helps our ombudsman get the information from our volunteers, which is the whole point of our program. I also have time for questions at the end with Amity, but I'd like people to take time to visit our website, which I have listed here, and those are the handouts that I provided. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And as she mentioned, any handouts that our presenters shared with us will be posted on the website with the webinar recording and slides. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and transfer this to Sarah, and Kelly, you can mute yourself, and Sarah, unmute, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. This is Sarah Hinsman. I'm the volunteer coordinator for the Iowa Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. And I want to share with you a few strategies that we have for risk management. Some might sound a little bit similar, but we all kind of have a different flavor. Just a little bit of background on our program. We are a centralized volunteer program with one dedicated volunteer program coordinator. I also currently have some AmeriCorps Vista members serving under me that help with volunteer management tasks at a regional level as well. In addition to that, we have 8 local, sometimes called regional ombudsmen, placed around the state. They primarily serve as subject matter experts for our volunteers. So if there's a question or a situation that I've kind of reached my capacity to help with, then I refer it to the ombudsman. Our local ombudsmen also do the orientation for volunteers at their new facility, and we encourage them to attend training and continuing education events, and just sort of be involved on a cursory level. They might also reach out to our volunteers to say, hey, could you look into a situation or follow up on a situation that I've worked on? So that's sort of how we operate. Our volunteers, when they're brand new, are certified for 1 year. We only assign them to one facility during that period of time, just to make sure that they fully understand and don't bite off more than they can chew. After their first year, we renew certification every other year, and if they would like to take on an additional facility, they may do so at that time once they have more experience. Okay, so I want to talk about a few different strategies we have, and they're here. Monthly reports, peer groups, our shadowing season, our formal complaint form, and how we decertify and terminate volunteers. I'm just going to scratch the surface on each of these. I'll show a few examples throughout my talk, and as everyone else has said, they will be available for your review after today, and if you would like to contact me independently to have a more in-depth discussion, I'm open to that as well. Okay, so I think this is kind of it's a very common thing for programs to do, but I think this is a huge risk management strategy, so I didn't want it to just go unstated that reviewing facility reports is a risk management strategy, and we make a point to always be up to date on those. So we have a standardized facility report form that our volunteers complete and send to us on a monthly basis. So we expect them to be in their facilities each month. It serves two purposes. The first is, of course, to collect the data that we all need to report to AOA or your annual reports or whatever. So we want, of course, to know what the volunteers' impact has been. But secondarily, it's just as important as a monitoring strategy. So first of all, if they didn't submit a report, why is that? We need to find out, do they have an issue with the commitment level or their comfort or satisfaction in the role? So we try not to let that go on too long. We expect them to notify us if they're not going to be able to make their visits because they were ill or on vacation or whatever. And we offer a leave of absence policy. So if they're not completing the minimum requirements, then we need to get on that pretty quickly and bring them back into the fold if possible. It also lets us know what issues they are encountering in the facility, and that's nice for us to be able to see on a global level, like what are the very common things that volunteers deal with, and then maybe share best practices between volunteers, or something that's really unusual that happens. So we have kind of that sort of thing. We might see things that are a red flag in terms of what they are doing in facilities. Maybe we don't want them to do that anymore. Or perhaps an educational opportunity. So if they're dealing with a particular issue, we could say, well, the rules and regs say that it has to be this way, or this is what another volunteer found success doing. So it gives us an opportunity to touch base every single month. And it also, we usually loop the local ombudsman back into these conversations. It's an opportunity for everybody to ask questions and get answers. And finally, we always respond to let the volunteer know that their report has been received and that we appreciate the work that they're doing, and then if there's anything specific we want to discuss with them, then we do so then. So it's an engagement strategy, it's a monitoring strategy, data collection, it's all of those things. But if the volunteer knows that they can expect contact from us on a monthly basis, I think they're more likely to be motivated to do what they need to do and be held accountable for that. So first, I want to talk about our peer groups. This is sort of similar maybe to a coffee klatch, except that we don't organize it. We sort of train specific volunteers to do all the organizing for us. So the purpose is to bring the local volunteer ombudsman together where they reside in a particular area of the state to discuss their experiences and continue to learn from one another. This creates a network of like-minded people who will be able to support one another throughout their term of service with us. So rather than coordinating each group ourselves, we appoint a volunteer ombudsman as a facilitator of these groups. We train them, we provide them guidelines for how to preside effectively over meetings, how to self-organize within their communities, and we give them the contact information of the people in their area. Because these individuals are kind of taking on a greater responsibility up and above from their regular volunteer duties, and they'll have probably the best insight into what's going on in the field, we have them serve as an advisory council member as well. And I won't discuss that in depth today, but they sort of get that as a reward. More opportunities to let us know how things are going. So the facilitator will organize their meetings, they will facilitate them, and we also deliver, or we give to the facilitator a little bit of a learning component. We develop short curricula, about 30 minutes long, for them to deliver on a topic. Like last June we did elder abuse for Elder Abuse Awareness Day. So it's an opportunity for them to get some continuing education, which we require, come together and support each other. And then the minutes from the meeting are taken by a member of that group, and they send that back with attendance to the program so that we can sort of monitor what's going on without having to do all the work ourselves. So a few other things I want to point out is that most of our volunteers do serve alone in their facilities. So they really do love this opportunity to get together and relate to one another. I find sort of similar to residents, there could be a variety of reasons why a volunteer might not tell the program what their issues are, but they will tell a friend or somebody that they feel comfortable with that is in their shoes. So the peer group gives them a safe place to do that. Our meetings are generally held 3 or 4 times a year, usually quarterly. So all we provide to those peer group leaders or facilitators is the handouts, contact information, and just do a conference call before each quarter just to let them know what our learning lesson will be, so they can feel comfortable delivering that. We also encourage them to talk about challenging situations in the program and get feedback and support. I've also seen these groups sort of correct volunteers themselves. A volunteer says, oh, well, I'm doing this thing in their facility, which the other volunteers happen to know is not within the boundaries. They all go, well, you know you're not supposed to do that, and then they'll tell me. So sometimes that's interesting as well. It takes the heat off of us from being the sole disciplinarian. And that's really important, I think. It's important for all the volunteers to feel like they're being held to the same standards, and they want everybody to be doing, you know, what they're supposed to be doing. So in any case, these give us an idea of trends across the state. And when we see people who are repeatedly not participating in peer group, you know, we want to find out why that is, encourage them to do that, and know that we need to monitor them a little bit more themselves. So I'm just showing real quick here, we have a facilitator's manual for this. It's going to undergo a few changes this year to change some contact information and whatnot, but I want to show you what our typical agenda looks like. So kind of a welcome, icebreaker, you know, review the business, any announcements that are pertinent, their little lesson plan, whatever the topic may be. We just had one on the family caregiver and how to better relate to families and facilities. And then collaboration. So this is just sort of their unstructured time to just talk about things that are going well, things that aren't going well, and just get some support. So those are peer groups. Shadowing. This is something that was new to us last year, but it was so well received, I think we're just going to make it an annual thing. So in answer to the question, what's going on out there once the volunteers are turned loose in the facility, our answer was to go out and have a peek. So we chose a random sample of volunteers, 2 per each of our 8 regions. We made sure that a quarter or 4 out of the 16 had at least 1 year of experience. So most of the people we were looking at were new-ish. Basically, this was really well received. The coordinator just scheduled a day after, and truly we were totally random. We just did a random Excel formula and it spat us back out some names. And random is really key because I felt some pressure from certain staff members to like go to the volunteers that seem more like an issue, a problem volunteer. And I said, no, I don't want this to be looked at or perceived to be punitive. It's truly just, let's get a slice of what's going on out there. So all we do is follow along, and this is a volunteer coordinator that goes out. We follow along our volunteer for the day, a couple hours actually in the facility. And I just ask them to show me what you typically do, you know, sort of pretend like I'm not here, and I'll just sort of follow you around, you know, kind of show me what your typical thing is. So we do these in the summer because the weather is nicer in Iowa. We compiled all the results and we shared them with all the volunteers. So we could say, based on, you know, these visits, these are the things that everybody seems to be doing really well. These are some things that people seem to have let slip since training. Overall, this was super well received. The volunteers felt super special that we came out to them. So it really re-engaged those particular volunteers. The communication between the volunteer and the coordinator like increased, you know, before, during, and after the event. It gave us a framework for how we envision those volunteers, how we visualize them when we look at those reports. We know the residents that they happen to be working with a lot, so it allowed us to give some more personalized feedback, like we were there with them, like we were really co-invested. So I have a report available. I'm not going to show that now based on our results last year, but it did help us determine what we needed to better emphasize in training. We do have, here it is, a form that we created for all of us so that we could see specifically the types of things we wanted the volunteer to demonstrate, like knocking on doors, you know, that they're a friendly person, that they get on the eye level with the residents if possible, the types of questions that they ask and how they ask them. Do they get the permission? What types of observations did they come to their attention? And how they interact with staff. So these were kind of the key things that we wanted to make sure our volunteers were hitting that we felt were really important. All right, so that's shadowing. I'm going to jump to probably what you're going to find the most interesting is our formal complaint form. So this was developed out of a situation that became kind of high risk, sort of our most egregious volunteer situation thus far, basically to mirror the process that we ended up completing. So this volunteer situation ultimately resulted in their termination. So we developed this formal complaint form to standardize this process moving forward so that everybody was clear on what would be done in serious issues with volunteers, and seriously serious. We got a lot of complaints that were basically hearsay, like, I heard that so-and-so at that facility where I know somebody that works there told me that this volunteer was whatever. I'm like, well, I'm not even going to track that down. So this cuts down on some of that. So the complaint is kind of the basis for action. We're only going to do something about it when a person fills out this complaint form. Without it, there's no guarantee we're going to do anything about that particular situation. We also have this written into our policies. The form itself doesn't explain every detailed internal policy, but I will show both to you. So anybody can use our form. I've had family members use it. I've had facilities use it. We also reserve the right to use it ourselves. But the gist is that it cannot be anonymous. That means that everybody involved in the grievance is held firmly accountable. You can see some of my notes there. So here's the form. And I know pertaining to grievances globally that are required for ombudsman programs, I know that the folks developing our policies for the ombudsman professionals took this, and it sort of models what we have developed. So basically, we want to hold everybody accountable. A few things happen. The volunteer does get notified. So it's a transparent process all the way through. The coordinator is responsible for doing kind of the investigation and determining if it's valid and if any further action is needed. And written follow-up will be given to the complainant. So basically, this is what the complainer sees. We want to get as much detail as possible. And detail is super, super important because without it, I just have to ask more questions. It just prolongs the process. So that can be tricky when you get sort of half-hearted complaints. So that's the form. And then I want to show you the policy to just kind of walk you through what we do on our end. Basically, what can happen is a corrective action plan. If we feel like, okay, the volunteer, probably genuinely did do something iffy, then, we want to make sure that we have that documented. So sorry, I'm scrolling real fast. Okay. Okay, so this is our volunteer policy here. So this is just sort of for internal purposes. So I'm looking at item B here. So if deemed necessary by the coordinator, we may develop a corrective action plan that may include re-education, increased monitoring, direct supervision, progress meetings, reassignment, or anything else that we think might be appropriate in the situation. The action plan has to have a completion date, so it can't just be in perpetuity. This person is under, stricter monitoring. So we want to have a goal and then have them be able to achieve that goal in a certain period of time. So it's kind of has a built-in review process. Document, as our first presenter said, everything needs to be documented forever and ever. The volunteer may or may not be permitted to continue independent facility visits. I've never had that extreme of a situation yet, but we're just trying to anticipate, where we might lay down some more parameters. We also kind of have a rule that, a person within their certification can't have like 2 or 3 formal complaints going at the same time. Like 1 is kind of the limit. If you're getting more than 1, there's probably something going on. Follow up with the complainant. Sometimes it may just result in termination straight away. And here's the rule: no more than 2 corrective action plans during their current period of certification. And then if we have to decertify them, then we go into the next phase. So just a few more things on the formal complaint form, just to give you some ideas of how we used it. So I receive a lot of calls, mostly from administrators or facility staff. They're like, well, I'm not too sure if this volunteer is doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I'm like, okay, I hear them out, and I say, if you want to file a formal complaint, here's the form. And sometimes just giving them the form kind of shuts it down, tells me maybe they, were just looking to complain about their volunteer, but didn't really have a leg to stand on. So in any case, one thing is that when we share these with the volunteer, when we have had occasion to do that, it does create some tension. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. In one instance, a volunteer just resigned before we could have that meeting to discuss corrective action. Wasn't necessarily a bad thing in hindsight. But in the other instance, there was a volunteer who got a formal complaint who was doing something absolutely right, which she had been trained to do, which was, refer a volunteer who wanted, or refer a resident who wanted information about returning to the community back to the social worker, as is their right. But the husband was not too keen on that. So in any case, that individual, the spouse, filed a complaint. So, he just didn't want his own spouse's rights honored. So we were there to mitigate. The volunteer didn't have to deal with this on their own. She was upset that that happened, but she was also really glad that we had her back. So what happened in that situation is that we informed the complainant of his wife's rights. We explained the volunteer's role and rights of access, because that complainant did not want the volunteer to ever have contact with that resident again, which, as you know, is not allowed. So ultimately, we reached a compromise whereby the volunteer would just avoid the topic of going home, if it was disruptive, and to not visit the resident while the spouse was present. So that is kind of what happened in that situation. So I think this is very handy. It just keeps everything very standardized. It limits the amount of work we have to do, and we just get random hearsay calls, and the complainant has to feel strongly enough, to go ahead and trigger this process. Now, that doesn't mean if it comes to us that a volunteer is really overstepping the bounds, that we wouldn't just take action without the complaint, but we would try to mirror that process. Last thing, while we're kind of on this topic, is decertification and termination. So sometimes the best thing is to part ways, and it's so hard, so very hard, and it's mostly the hardest as a coordinator, just to prepare yourself mentally for that conversation. But think about it this way, if the volunteer has really not been able to adapt to corrective action or does something harmful and you're not going to give them another chance, it's time to kind of cash in your losses there. So I like to think about, do I want this volunteer's documented issues to be in the media and still have them be serving? So no, that would be a bad thing for the program. So the best thing for us is to protect the program and cover our own butts as coordinators. So in any case, sometimes it leads us into this situation. For one thing, I regularly terminate volunteers who are just not meeting the minimum requirements of the program. They just have ghosted away, or, can't fulfill the commitment, try to coach them into understanding that this isn't a good fit for them. So I don't lose any sleep over that, but it's really hard when they are active, maybe they're a little too active, and they do want to stay in the program. I think the biggest issue for us as coordinators is that we're going to feel like a failure. You really do. You feel like, what did I miss? Was there anything else I could have done to avoid this situation? And you can't beat yourself up like that, but you probably will in your own mind. So it's really super hard to fire a volunteer, even though when you know it's the best thing. As I said, the preparation is kind of the hardest part. But preparation is also key, right? And as many people have said, document everything. I would encourage, the moment a volunteer starts to get testy, put it all on the record. Even if, this isn't a point where you have to take action, just file it away. I have volunteers that are serving right now that have, some stuff in their file, just in case it ever escalates, and I can go back and sort of establish a pattern. So just don't ever overlook it. Just always have it on file. It doesn't have to be super public, but just for your own sanity. I find that delivering the news to volunteers in this respect is not as bad as you might think. Due to the distance that volunteers are placed throughout our state, I'm usually doing this over the phone, but I have on occasion invited people who are closer to our home office to come in person. When you terminate, I would encourage you to have a witness, to the conversation, somebody who's a fairly impartial party. It's recommended that that witness be the same gender as the volunteer that you're bringing in. That witness should be taking notes of the conversation, so you don't have to speak and take notes and respond, and sign and date those notes for documentation. Keep this whole conversation to the point. You've already taken your corrective action. The decision is already made, so it's not a period to negotiate. It's just, it's like it's time to part ways. I'm sorry to deliver this news, but you're no longer a member of our program, and here's what's going to happen now. So what I usually do after that conversation, well, if they're in person, if the meeting's in person, get all their materials then. Otherwise, if it's, kind of a phone-based termination, then I include, that it's on them to return their materials. Right away, as soon as that decision has been handed down, the conversation's over, I call or email everybody involved so that they know, the administrator of the facility knows this volunteer is no longer a representative of our office. The ombudsman knows. So anybody who might be getting a call or a visit in an angry fashion knows it's done. Regarding the materials return, they're required to send back their materials on their own dime. That's written into our policies, which they sign off on, before they're even certified. Some don't. I don't sweat about that too much. It's in their official letter, so if they don't comply with it, then that's their problem. I will share an example of how we decertified a volunteer later on when we have time for scenarios, and I have some documentation to share, which includes our termination letter and evaluation, which also are very helpful for your own purposes. And I would keep everything, even a volunteer, once they've been terminated or resigned or left the program, I keep all of that stuff on file in case I ever leave someday. All that information is there for somebody to find if a person were to come back to the program that has been a problem in the past. It's all there for somebody to review. So those are a few of my risk management strategies once the volunteer is kind of in the chute and is doing their own thing. So I'm happy to take questions later on and talk a little bit more about our scenario when I get a chance. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. All right. Excellent presentations with lots of great tips. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do now, let me switch it back to my slides. I've asked all three presenters to share a situation that they've had in their program where a volunteer has either exposed their program to risk due to their actions or had the potential to do so. I've asked them to talk about how they handled that particular situation, as well as share what adjustments they made in their program to try to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. So first we're going to ask Mary Ann to share her situation. And Mary Ann, you can unmute your line.
Okay, I'm ready. I was taking some notes, so now I have to go back and talk now. It was a great presentation. Yes, about 4 years ago, we accepted to a volunteer. She went through all, our training. She completed the application, the criminal background check and training. She did everything. During that process, she said she was semi-retired, but was a realtor. But she said on a very, kind of part-time basis. She still did that. So she was assigned to a facility. Everything seemed to be going well, but after a few months, it appears the volunteer started talking about her role as a realtor with the residents. A family member called us, our volunteer coordinator, and it appeared it could be that she was soliciting business, though no one had apparently signed up with her or, had her to sell their home. The volunteer coordinator received the call and then immediately informed our state ombudsman and the ombudsman assigned to the home. So we got involved, and then we talked with her. So the steps we did when we found out that this was going on, we weren't sure of it, so we spoke with her immediately and then arranged for a meeting. So we had a meeting. At the same time, our ombudsman specialist assigned to that home kind of started doing some investigation and checking with the home to ensure that so far she had only mentioned her business but was not representing a resident at the facility. We did some interviewing with a family member, the resident, facility staff, and during the period, the conversation, continued with the resident. We kind of started doing a little bit of retraining just to make sure, because we hadn't found out for sure that she had stepped over at that point, but we wanted to understand that she knew the role of the ombudsman, our code of ethics. We kind of started trying to do some retraining with her. And though she appeared initially to agree and understand, she still tried to argue, and kind of what I told her about skill sets, that this skill set, this experience as a realtor was important and a topic that she should discuss with residents and family members. She didn't kind of seem to understand, even though we had meetings with her, about utilizing your experience was not the same as soliciting business. So at that point, we were still kind of trying to work with her, but we found out that she was actually soliciting business from fellow volunteers, and they weren't feeling comfortable with that. So that's when we decided we were, she wasn't really going to stop the practice. It could go back to the residents, and steps were taken then to decertify her and have her leave the program. And we did not refer her to any other programs. And kind of our learning was during the training, you know, we talk a lot about utilizing the skills and the experience, but we really wanted to, again, utilize how does that fit in with the code and the ombudsman role. I could be a doctor and go to the nursing home, but I'm not going to start treating patients. And we realized we maybe hadn't made that as clear, so we added a more kind of stringent component in our training. And that's my example.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I asked our presenters to share their scenarios today just to, I know you already know this, but that share the commonalities that all these programs have, because I think you'll notice after these scenarios are shared that there's some common trends that we can all walk away with, and that these issues occur in every program. You can do your best to avoid risk and prepare for risks, but you can't avoid all of them entirely since we're dealing with people. So you're not alone out there if you've had a situation that put your program at risk, or you had a situation where you had to decertify someone or something similar. So let's move to Kelly, and she can share her scenario now.
Thank you, Amity. I have to say that I have not heard that realtor story, and I hope I don't have to. That was quite good. Thank you. So mine is a few years ago, a potential volunteer signed up for the program, provided all the information requested during the screening process as required by our policy, of course passed the background check and the formal application process. The coordinator actually had time to meet with this person prior to the mandatory initial training to see them and discuss responsibilities and requirements for the program. The person participated in the initial training with the volunteer coordinator and the regional ombudsman and did very well in that. Nothing came up. So they discussed the facility selection for the person, and the person requested a certain facility, and she said it's for location and convenience. The facility was open and needed a volunteer, so it was decided on that particular facility. So at this time, there's no apparent conflict. We're moving on. The volunteer coordinator sets up the facility orientation, the date and time with the facility administration. It's the one and only time that we let them know we're coming in, and we go with the new volunteer. This is our policy. So all this is said and done. The orientation has not taken place yet. So prior to the coordinator going with the volunteer to the facility, the potential volunteer goes to the facility on their own and begins threatening the staff with her power as the new volunteer ombudsman, indicating her vendetta and how she would be vindicated now. She posted threats and accusations on Facebook and previously filed grievances with the Division of Quality Assurance and had a possible lawsuit against this particular facility. So none of this came out in all of our thorough screening and discussions and face-to-face time or anything. So like Amity said, you can do your best, but you just don't know. So this comes out to my attention because the facility administration contacts our DQA, which is our Division of Quality Assurance, and DQA calls me. It was bright and early on a Monday morning, so I can never really forget it. I really couldn't believe it, but I said I'm going to discuss this with the volunteer coordinator, find out, what the details were, how did this happen, kind of thing, and we would go from there. Luckily, I had a pretty good relationship with DQA as well, so they knew that we would be on top of it and take care of things. So what was discussed with our state ombudsman and our legal counsel was that a very, very formal letter was drafted and sent to this potential volunteer on state ombudsman letterhead indicating what was happening, and I did include that for everybody as a sample. This person was red flagged in our database, is not to be accepted into the program at any time in the future, and our formal volunteer application was revised to reflect the direct conflict of interest to become a volunteer in the program with any history of filing grievances or lawsuits against a facility. So we can kind of get a feeling for that. And, if they don't state it on the application and it comes through, then we have more evidence to say, what, we aren't going to allow you in this program, or, really sorry about that, but we take this very, very seriously, and the residents that we serve come first. And just for the record, the Board on Aging and Long-Term Care does have disclaimers everywhere that we can deny anybody access to being a volunteer ombudsman in this program at any time. So that's my story.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, Sarah, would you like to share your situation, please?
Sure. Just want to say I'm kind of nodding in agreement to both of those. I've had similar, although unique in their own right situations as well. So great examples. Okay, so mine is a little bit more nebulous, which was tough. It was our very first volunteer termination. And all I can really characterize this situation as is that this volunteer had a personality conflict with pretty much everybody in the facility. He was just a very odd person. He had a weird personality that just kind of made people a little uneasy. Some people called him creepy. He never really did anything. It was just kind of his manner, his way of speaking, his limited eye contact, and those types of things. So this started, and this went on for a few months. It started in August when we got kind of our first complaint, and then we ended up not recertifying the volunteer in February of the following year. So the staff called us and said, hey, we've got a problem. And I happened to be traveling to that community, which was on the other side of the state for another reason. So I said, well, I'm actually going to be in your area. Why don't we just sit down that afternoon and have a conversation? So the administrator was like, I want this guy out of here. And I was like, okay, well, we're not just going to do that. Let's do our due diligence. So we had a meeting with staff, and we developed kind of a plan of correction. Like I said, this is the situation that created our formal complaint form. So increased monitoring. I was going to do some re-education with this volunteer, particularly about how to appropriately interact with staff, to keep it professional, to let them do their jobs, and not take up too much of their time, and, focus on the residents' concerns and not the staff's concerns. We agreed that the facility and I would touch base on a monthly basis to see, has this volunteer improved? I also encouraged the facility, because they had not done this, and I encouraged them to document everything from their perspective. If you need to take testimonials from your direct care workers that are interacting with this volunteer, what specifically is this volunteer doing that is harmful, So they did. But nevertheless, it kind of kept going back to, this volunteer is just creepy. He's just like making people uncomfortable just by his manner of existing. So in any case, that's very hard to correct when it's just like, that's just who you are. So then we sort of had to look at, okay, because this volunteer was starting to request things like, I want a HIPAA release form so that I can see the records of residents, which in Iowa we don't allow at the volunteer level, so we had to be like, no, document that. Notice that the volunteer was going way above and beyond the minimum hours, so he was in the facility a lot, yet he wasn't accomplishing a lot of resolutions, things that you would expect a volunteer with our level of training and that much involvement at the facility, you'd expect a little bit more result, or a little bit more in process at that point. So he was really good at identifying issues, not so effective at the follow-through and resolution. So he was becoming upset, I think, with himself for his lack of results. He just, for some reason, didn't know or couldn't understand after retraining how to, work through those issues. So he was over-involved, not effective, starting to skirt the boundaries, making people uncomfortable. Really came to a head when we actually got a complaint from a skilled resident that had gone back into the community, called our ombudsman to talk about some of her concerns at the facility, which included the creepiness of this particular volunteer. So, of course, when a resident now is involved, that sort of takes it to another level, in my opinion. So in any case, as this is all happening and we're trying to sort of recorrect the volunteer and just accumulating all these things and kind of looking for something, he was applying for his second-year recertification. And we just kind of knew that's not going to happen, but we got to get all our ducks in a row. So we made a point to evaluate the volunteer, which we do annually with every volunteer who applies for recertification. And we're very honest. And Amity, I don't know if you can bring up my screen one more time, but I can kind of show you a sample of what I have going there. I mean, maybe the controls.
Yeah, Sarah, I can't right now if you don't mind, but we'll share it afterwards because we're running short on time anyhow.
All right, no worries. So in that, first of all, is the letter, which is pretty short and sweet, that, hey, we're no longer, we're not going to be able to renew your certification, and that means that you're no longer a representative of our office, and, you know, how to kind of close out their service. We also send a letter to the facility saying, hey, this volunteer is no longer certified. They're not assigned to your facility, so you can go ahead and remove any. We give them a poster of that volunteer and their contact information, so you can go ahead and remove that. And then we also gave him his evaluation, which basically, you know, was chock full of the feedback I just provided. That's hard too, to be like, I can't tell you you're just a creepy person, but I can rely on those factual things that we can kind of hang our hat on and say, you weren't particularly effective, the staff and the residents were concerned about your, the way you conducted yourself in the facility, and all those sorts of things. So in any case, that's kind of our person, our most out there person right now. We've had a few since, but this one in particular, it was like my first volunteer firing. It just made me sweat and lose sleep and things, but turned out it all kind of worked out in the end. I was expecting this volunteer to be really upset and act out in some way, but they didn't. They just kind of said, okay, and that was it. So that was mine.
Thank you, Sarah. Those situations are always hard, certainly. So thanks for sharing those cases with us and those examples. We do have a few minutes for questions. So if you have questions, as a reminder, remember you can click the hand icon to raise your hand, or you can send a question through the chat feature. I do have one in there right now, and it looks like it's for Sarah. Are the peer groups in place of in-service trainings, or do you do both? Our program currently does monthly in-services, but these peer groups sound very beneficial.
Yeah, so they are in addition to, I wouldn't say we do total in-service stuff, but we offer a lot of opportunities for volunteers to get their continuing education requirements. We do twice a year, have done so far, like a volunteer education and appreciation event in each of those 8 ombudsman regions around the state. We usually do those in April for Volunteer Month and October for Residents' Rights Month. We also do bi-monthly conference calls for our whole volunteer program, and then the peer groups. So as it happens, if you kind of participate in a few of those each year, then a volunteer should be able to complete their continuing education requirement. So a little of both.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Let's see. How do you talk to a volunteer, and I guess this is for anyone who doesn't submit activity reports, one-on-one, or as a group without singling anyone out? I would say, and I know this is for the presenters, but just to keep it short for the sake of time, when you're dealing with a issue, it's always important to speak specifically with the individual, and then, of course, speak with the group as well. So speak with the individual, talk about that particular performance issues, look at your policies and procedures, see if you need to make any changes. If you do, then share those changes with the larger group, even if it's just a reminder to the whole group about submitting reports on time or whatever that performance issue is. And for the person that asked that question, I will review in the resources. We have a link to our webinar from last year, which talks a lot about communication strategies and dealing with those type of challenging situations. And I'm going to share some more tips in a few moments on another slide. Let's see. Question we received about termination. And if you could just really quickly say yes or no, all the presenters. Does the volunteer have any legal recourse following termination?
No.
No. No.
And just to be clear, as you saw in the rule language, and I know I didn't go in depth with that, we just don't have time for that, and that's not the purpose of this call today, but it just states that there needs to be a grievance process that gives folks the opportunity to file a complaint about an action taken by the Ombudsman, about decertification, designation, anything really, and that the Ombudsman has to respond. But it does not say that the Ombudsman, but it specifically states that the Ombudsman, meaning the state Ombudsman, has the final say in that outcome. So I'm not sure if that helps.
We always give them an opportunity to appeal like a decision that we made, but yeah, I'm usually right down the hall to my state ombudsman to be like, so here's the situation in case you get a call. And then we've had to kind of have her respond to a couple volunteers that have, or potential volunteers that have made that appeal to be able to say, no, you know, your skills aren't a fit for the opportunities that we have. So.
Great, thank you. Another question was asking about evaluation forms and if they would be available. Yes. The presenters that talked about their evaluation forms, those will be posted on the website with the webinar materials, and I'm also going to share a couple other examples in just a couple minutes. So.
Amity, if I could say one other thing with respect to the checking in about monthly reports. I do this a lot, and I always follow up one-on-one with the volunteer, and I come at it with not like a, hey, where's your report, but like a, hi, I haven't heard from you a while, and I'm just checking in. First of all, I want to make sure that you're okay and that your family's okay. You know, I just love to hear from you because I want to make sure that you're still interested in this opportunity because I think you've done great work in the past, if that's the case. And, you know, just try to kind of approach it in that respect. So.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. And one last question, and I know that unfortunately we ran short on time for questions, but I will work with the presenters. If we didn't address any of these questions, I'll connect with them and make sure we respond back to you all with answers if possible. Someone asked, and I believe it was was it Mary Ann's situation or Kelly, about the lawsuit. Said that your policy said that a volunteer applicant could be disqualified if they had any history of a lawsuit against a facility. Is that basically the wording that you used?
The wording, the actual wording was discussed about revamping the application and asking them if they have filed a lawsuit against a facility.
Perfect. So just a yes or no, and then you can follow up with them for more information, right?
Right.
Great. Thank you. Okay, well, if I could ask the presenters to mute your line, I'm going to go ahead and move to slides. Thank you very much. And thank you for the questions. And again, I apologize for running short on time, but I think that you got a whole lot of information packed into this webinar. We do understand that all programs are different. All program structures are unique. And not all programs have a full-time volunteer coordinator. We understand that. So the point of these webinars are really to have you walk away with some tips, some practices, and even some forms or resources that you can adapt specifically to your program needs. So I want to take a couple minutes to review some resources we have on the website. We created this new risk management considerations worksheet. This concept for this worksheet actually came from an ombudsman, Rhonda DeBow. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If I'm not, I apologize. She's a volunteer coordinator out of Minnesota. And the content for the worksheet she drew from the webinar that we did last year. So the worksheet provides key points for programs to consider regarding risk management. The chart highlights areas of risk and tips to reducing risk to help ombudsmen evaluate their programs and identify risk, review current program practices and policies, and develop recommendations for improvements. So that is available on our website now, and it's as a PDF and a Word document. So you can download it now, take a fresh look at your program, and really evaluate your program for risk and come up with some solutions. I included a couple screenshots of Rhonda's worksheet so you could see how she thought through the process and provided some examples for you. So thank you again for sharing that with us. So I wanted to share that with you guys to just demonstrate that we really don't want you to have to recreate the wheel. We know you're limited on time, and so there's a lot of valuable information on the website, and a lot of it comes from you all. So thank you for that. Another thing for you to look at for an introduction to risk management is a 30-minute tutorial. It's completely free, and as you walk through it, there's also some downloadable free resources that you can use from the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. So check that out. These are two forms from the Texas Ombudsman Program. The one on the left, the shadowing visit and evaluation form, is from the state office, so they use that statewide. The one on the right is a volunteer evaluation, so the volunteer can provide feedback about their experience in the program that they volunteer for. And that's from the Bear and Alamo Area Agencies on Aging. So thanks for sharing those with us. This is a tool we did talk about last year, but it's now, I wanted to bring it back up again because it really talks about training and a way to reduce risk by providing a process for your ombudsman volunteers to look at the type of complaint they've received and then determine whether or not they have to consult with a staff ombudsman before they get involved in that complaint. So this is from New Hampshire. They took all the North code, put them into this chart, which is available on our website, and they share it with their volunteers in training, and it really gives them a really good understanding of their boundaries and when they need to consult with their staff ombudsman. So communication tips. Some of you asked our presenters, how do you talk about this issue? How do you address this? I found this the other day on the Aging Network Volunteer Collaborative website. It's out of Pennsylvania. It was from their State Unit on Aging. It's a toolkit. And we highlighted it in we're going to highlight it in the recent Ombudsman Outlook, but I wanted to share it with you now too. Chapter 6 has some prompts about having some crucial conversations with volunteers, some really sensitive ones that may be hard because you're talking about their volunteer performance. So check that out. I think that will help a lot. More links for information. Again, there's that webinar we had last year. There's a lot of great information there. And then we also have other archived webinar recordings and materials on that page listed there. Additional resources about risk are on this slide, and then volunteer management on the bottom. NORC resources and support. This slide is just to remind you of all of what we have available. So I really want to highlight the NORC compendium up on the upper right-hand side. It's a compendium that includes examples from state and local programs about recruitment, training, and retention, as well as a curriculum for staff ombudsmen to read. So I know that was quick, and I apologize for that, but at least you will have these slides after this webinar, and you can review them, and you'll have the links as well. So I want to say thank you so much to Mary Ann, Kelly, and Sarah for their excellent presentations, and thank you for spending time with us this afternoon. Again, the recording and materials will be posted on our website soon, and we will send you a link to that as well. If you have any questions about this webinar or anything on our website, don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact information is on this slide, and make sure to connect with us on social media. Once this webinar is closed, you will be directed to a very quick 5-question evaluation. Please fill that out because we really appreciate any feedback that you can provide, not just about today's webinar, but how NORC can support you in your volunteer management. So thank you for all the ombudsman work that you do, and we really appreciate you. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you all.